Hi, we return to 1 Kings 2 today after the very Deuteronomic introduction to David's final words that we saw in the first verses of chapter 2, which are then shockingly shifted here as we see as he goes directly into giving assassination orders to his son, the newly enthroned Solomon. And we don't hear anything from Solomon in this scene. This is all just David's words. And then he dies unceremoniously. Unlike the patriarchs in Genesis whose names were told and that they lived fullness of years, we hear nothing about that. David just simply dies and sleeps with his fathers. And there's no apparent ceremony to remember him or anything. It just turns directly to Solomon following up on his brother Adonijah's request from Bathsheba for Abishag, and that will not end well for Adonijah. But then there's nothing about David. So we have to understand what's going on here. Why does David order the death of Joab? And one could take a step back and ask, why are the authors putting these words in the final words of David? He could have ended his final words at the end of 2 Samuel with the psalm there and the celebration of his warriors and the buying of the threshing floor of the Jebusite. But it doesn't. It ends here. And I'm going to suggest that what's going on here is a version of what we saw in the David story, where the very people like Joab, the sons of Zeruiah, killed people that were very convenient for David to have killed, and David disclaimed them all. And now Solomon will carry out David's will here, and he doesn't ever disclaim it, that it was his father's will, but certainly readers can understand this is the will of David and not necessarily the will of Solomon. But the will of Solomon will be what applies to Adonijah, so we can't disclaim Solomon there altogether. And again, I'd like to suggest this is evidence of this being said from the time of the actual succession itself. Why would somebody 200 years later, perhaps in the time of Hezekiah, or even later in the time of Josiah, which is what I was suggesting the Deuteronomic intro to this chapter is from, care about the assassination orders of all these people? Is it that they want to destroy the memory of David that way? Well, there are other ways to do that. And as we look more closely at this scene here, we can see there's at least two voices going on throughout the entire thing. So, as we've been doing, we're looking at these first two chapters of the Solomon narrative, and as I've been noting, it'll shift radically when we get to chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 2 is very different from chapter 1, where we saw the confusion of various forces going back and forth between the Adonijah side and the Solomon side before David finally made the decision. With Solomon on the throne, chapter 2 is much quieter, at least so far, and it won't stay quiet all along. But it's one person at a time with Solomon, as we see, not the chaos that we saw before. And then it'll shift radically in chapters 3 and 4, as we'll see, and beyond. The shape of our immediate chapter you can see here, beginning with this paragraph. We saw this first paragraph last time, and you can see here how radically the tone shifts. About walking before my face in truth with all their heart, with all their being. That's Yahweh's voice, supposedly. Your successor shall not be cut off from the throne of Israel. And now, moreover, you know what Joab did. So having talked about all that goodness, now he goes directly into ordering murder. And the ambiguity of this is at many levels, given that Solomon's name means peaceful. And yet peace is a couple of times in here that David is not ordering to have happen. So he starts this way, as we see in verse 5. Moreover, you know also what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me, and this is how it's presented, how he dealt with the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether, whom he murdered, retaliating in time of peace for blood that had been shed in war, and putting the blood of war on the belt around his waist and on the sandals on his feet. Therefore, according to your wisdom, act according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. In other words, from this perspective, if we just read these verses, we think, boy, what a bad person Joab has been, and good thing David is going to break the cycle of revengeful blood here and end it with Joab and give Solomon the choice of how to do that. But if we look back at the story of Joab, we see it's much more complicated than that. What's characterized here as dealing with the two commanders of the army of Israel was much more complicated. And I won't go back over the whole story, but at least have these little summaries of the history of Joab in service to David in 2 Samuel. So we saw it in the very beginning, before David is officially king, when Saul and he were still struggling over it. David came to Hebron, and David was king in Hebron over Judah, rather, not over Israel, and Saul still over Israel. And Joab, representing David's army, and Abner, representing Saul's army, came with each with 12 of their slaves to meet at the pool of Gibeon, where all their slaves killed each other. In the aftermath, Abner killed Joab's brother Asahel, who he tried not to kill. He said to Asahel, stop pursuing me, go get some spoils, because what will I say to your brother Joab? But Asahel kept coming after him, and Abner plainly killed him in self-defense. But afterwards, Joab murdered Abner in blood vengeance there. So that's the story we saw there that David's going back to about Abner. But what was Joab supposed to do? Abner stopped them along the way when he was chasing him and said, "Will the sword eat forever?" And Joab stopped for then. Obviously, his family, according to the tradition of the time, could not let one of his brothers be killed without him responding. But notice that none of that's mentioned here. Nothing about Asahel's murder and nothing about Abner beginning the process of blood vengeance. The cycle there is mentioned there. So then we see how Joab is a faithful servant leading David's army in battle against the Arameans and the Ammonites, and the Ammonite war continued while Joab was out there, while David was dallying around with his general's wife Bathsheba. And when that happened, Joab didn't challenge him at all. Nathan challenges him in the next chapter 12, but we don't need to look at that now. We've already seen that. But Joab doesn't challenge him. He just goes along with the hideous command to put Uriah at the front of the fighting and make it look like it was an accident. And Joab even allows more of men to be killed so that David's cover-up can be more effective. Of course, it's not effective. It's in the book, and we know about it. But at least portray Joab as an utterly faithful servant to David. Then later in chapter 14, when Absalom is wondering what to do and David is paying no attention after Absalom's sister was raped by her half-brother Amnon, the narrator noted, Joab perceived that David's mind was on Absalom and goes to Tekoa to get the so-called wise woman of Tekoa to come back and pose as a widow to get David back on track, which it partially succeeds to do. But at least there's again Joab thinking of nothing else than getting his boss David's mind back on the job of being king. And then finally, after Absalom's rebellion goes on, and many of David's people end up siding with Absalom, as the people of Israel in the streets are said to do, Joab leads the battle against the forces of Absalom. And even though David is ambivalent about whether he wants his son Absalom, my son, to die, Joab understands what's going on and has Absalom killed. And when David is mourning and the army is about to melt away, feeling useless, that David is mourning, that they've risked their lives to stop Absalom, Joab wakes David and gets him back to action. And then finally in chapter 20, after Amasa, who betrayed David by siding with Absalom, and then came back, delayed in filling out the command that David had given him, and David seemed to miss it, Joab recognized that Amasa was really not on David's side and went out and killed him. So we describe those as murders. The first one is certainly revenging his brother's death, which is not named here. And Amasa, who betrayed David, and Joab could see was not faithful to David, died to protect the king. And yet both of them are killed here, described as retaliating in time of peace for blood that had been shed in time of war. And certainly Amasa's death was not in a time of peace. It was in the moment of consolidation. Yes, there was peace in that Absalom was dead, but David is still trying to figure out how to get the throne back and get the people back on his side. And Amasa was a great threat that there'd still be division amongst the people and that David's reign would not be secure. So Joab is doing a strategically important thing, and yet now he's being killed for it. And as my note has further below, retaliating in time of peace for blood that has been shed in war is exactly what David's asking Solomon to do. This is a time of peace, and he's telling him to kill Joab in this time of peace to make up for blood that had been shed in time of war, the blood that Joab had shed to protect David. There's some further ironies that we need to look at in the details here. So Amasa, son of Jether, we don't see again until verse 32, but otherwise it's not in the books of Samuel. We've not heard that there. I missed this note going back. What he did to me, as Falkman notes, means that David put the two murders under the caption of what Joab did to me. And that's been his case all along. You sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me, like he's a victim of them. Using the word murdered here, the specific word for murdered, which we'll see in verse 32, could have said killed. There are many other Hebrew words we've seen: slaughtered, struck, fought, and those things, but the specific word for murdered. In time of peace, we see shalom, which is a key word in some ways in the chapter. I didn't mark it as a specifically key word there, but it's 4 times and twice in one verse, and then we'll see it again down there. Putting in this fascinating image, putting the blood of war on the belt around his waist, which is what we saw there at this moment, with a belt and a sword fastened around his waist. And that's when he kills Amasa. So that one makes sense of the scene. But the sandals on his feet we did not see there. And it's a very unusual term. The term Na'al for sandal is only here in the entire books of Samuel and Kings. But it echoes 2 key places. One, of course, in Exodus 3:5, when Moses is told to take the sandals off his feet. Certainly no blood on those sandals. But even more interestingly, in the echo of the Moses scene in Exodus, in the Joshua scene in Joshua 5:15, when the commander of the army of Yahweh said to Joshua in a similar incident, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy. But now it's in the context of a military march where Yahweh says through this commander, I've handed Jericho over to you. So it's setting Joshua up to be a warrior where certainly he would get blood on the sandals of his feet. And the book of Joshua may well have been written in the time of Josiah, so may well not be known by the audience of 1 Kings. And similarly with the Exodus story, which, as I've been noting throughout, will justify the Jeroboam rebellion, which doesn't start in the story world until chapter 13. Whether that was written before or after this verse in 1 Kings 2, it's hard to say for sure. But certainly readers, soon right after it was written, at the earliest time it was written, would have recognized the contrast between sandals on the feet to be taken off to be holy ground where Yahweh is present, versus here as an expression of why Joab needs to die. And then we see from Halberstadt and Holmes, the ambiguity of David's motivation for having Joab killed cannot be expunged and mocks the most ingenious scholarly attempts at disambiguation. My note has the chiasm down below that we saw on the right side. So act according to your wisdom. Notice, not Yahweh's wisdom. In chapter 3 in the dream, Solomon will dream that Yahweh gives him divine wisdom. But David doesn't know that, and it hasn't happened yet. David will be dead when it happens. And after all, it's only a dream. It's only private experience that Solomon knows until he told whoever is told, and now it's in the text as an official statement that readers can read to suggest that Yahweh's really on Solomon's side, giving him that kind of wisdom. But as we'll see when we get to chapter 3, it was a dream. So he says, act according to your wisdom, Chokmah, the first of numerous times attributed to Solomon. And when I've taught the overview I used to teach a class in churches called Messiahs Before Jesus, where we did a quick overview of Saul and David and Solomon. And every time I asked in churches, what's one word you associate with Solomon? The answer is wisdom. And here's the reason why. It's put in the story as propaganda. But as I write out in my book, Come Out My People, it's one of three kinds of biblical wisdom: apocalyptic wisdom, prophetic wisdom, and royal wisdom. And this is certainly royal wisdom, how to hold a monarchy together. It'll be precisely the kind of wisdom that his son Rehoboam will be shown not to have, because he doesn't listen to the elders who bear that kind of wisdom. As Beale notes below, it is a chilling first appearance of the word wisdom in the narrative, for it is a wisdom to contextualize politically expedient murder in Torah obedience. Another way of saying what I call the religion of empire. But notice how it's negatively here. It's positively, if I put up the key words here, it's negatively on this side. Do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. And the other way around here, you must bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol. So contrasting with peace with blood, and must versus do not. In a curious sort of parallel there. The word for gray head here, sevatoth here, is again in verse 9, but it's not elsewhere in Samuel Kings. It's a different word from being a graybeard, a zaken, which usually means a man old enough to have wisdom if his facial hair is turned gray. Here it's about a head hair, and certainly I know the experience that facial hair turns gray before head hair, as you can see. Head hair tends to fall out, sometimes at least, as you can also see. So do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace, which suggesting that Joab is either old now or don't let him get old and die in peace before he becomes a gray head. And we've seen Sheol a couple of other times in the Deuteronomistic history. It's not hell, despite some people thinking of that. It's simply the underground, the underworld where every dead body goes. This is long before there's any sense of resurrection that we see in texts like Daniel 12, where there's some sense of some kind of afterlife. This is just under the ground where people go, where they die, and there's no sense of judgment in that. Then he shifts, and we see that in the chiasm here, in the B part of the chiasm. But deal with chesed, or literally make chesed, or make covenant loyalty. As my note has in the mouth of the king, it's a matter of political alliance rather than love. As Brueggemann notes below, and I think this is a key point about Barzillai, who we'll look at in more detail in just a minute, David is aware that the throne does not exist in a political vacuum, but depends upon strategically placed, powerful allies among the landed. Thus, the urging of fidelity is not only an obligation, but a practical act as well. So here's what he says to do with him. deal with Hesed, or make Hesed, with the sons of Barzillai the Gilead, and let them be among those who eat at your table. For with such loyalty they met me when I fled from your brother Absalom. Let's take a pause to look at Barzillai and his sons, because that's who he says to deal with his sons. If we recall, and we don't have to recall because I have it here on the right side, in the green box we discovered that Barzillai was a very aged man, very specifically 80 years old. But let's go back a little bit to 1 Samuel 18, where we have the first veiled reference that Saul's daughter Merab was to be given to David, and she was given to Adriel the Mahalathite as a woman, or as a wife. I changed that because there is no specific word in Hebrew for wife. What we don't know there is the connection with what we find out here at the end of 2 Samuel, that Adriel is son of Barzillai the Mahalathite. And so these children here of Saul's grandchildren, are the grandchildren of Barzillai, if Mahalathite is the same as Gileadite. And they're not the same place, but is it likely that there's two people named Barzillai in the story this way? And especially since they occur surrounding the scene where Barzillai the Gileadite is there with David, seems very unlikely, but I suppose it's possible. If we pause to look geographically here, we can see Gilead is this land in the Transjordan here, this broad area, which today would be in the nation of Jordan. But Mahalath, the other place located here, is not known by scholars, but somewhere understood to be on the west side of the Jordan here. So they're not the same place. Is there confusion about where Barzillai is from? That's really all we can know about it. But after that first scene we saw in 2 Samuel 17, when David is fleeing from Absalom, Barzillai the Gileadite comes with these other people from the Transjordan area and brings all these supplies to support David and his people along the way. So that's where he supported them in the face of the Absalom rebellion. And then we got to the scene where David tried to reward him by bringing him back to Jerusalem with him, but Barzillai said, I'm old, there's no point in my doing that now. And they settle it very peacefully, and the king kisses him and blesses him, and he returns home. But then we got to near the very end of 2 Samuel, and we find out that these 5 sons of Merab were David allowed to be killed to make up for the blood guilt that the story was about here. But later Rizpah, the mother of them, witnessed to their dead bodies, and Yahweh relented. And so in that context, it was, as we saw there, it was Rizpah's witness that generates Yahweh's relenting rather than the fulfilling of the blood guilt. But what that means is these 5 sons were already dead. So if we're looking at the question of who these sons are there other sons of Barzillai? Perhaps, but we don't know anything about them. And certainly that David knows this according to 2 Samuel 21. Does Solomon know about it? It's all very confused there. And he says, let them be among those who eat at your table, which is where he wanted to put Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, the son of Jonathan there. So we understood that there is to keep an eye on him, to keep your enemies close, so that a grandson of Saul couldn't become a rival. Is that what's meant here? We also notice my note there has from 2 Kings 25 at the very end, how the Babylonians allowed the former king in Jerusalem to eat at the Babylonian king's table, with that same sense of keeping them close, keeping them captive. So is that what's at issue here? But Brueggemann's point is wider, and as we'll see, Solomon will not carry this out. So I can comment now on something that's a negative in the story, because it doesn't ever happen, which is Brueggemann suggests this is a part of the shift from the family network-based kingship of David to the more international covenant tribute-based kingship of Solomon that we'll see especially in chapter 4 and what follows. So some of this we'll have to understand there. So he tells him to deal with Hesed, which is suggest to provide for them, but Solomon won't do it. He simply ignores them as far as we can tell. So I'll scroll down a little bit so we can see the end of our scene here, and then we come to Shimei. And so we can put up something about Shimei here as well, and we've seen him twice. We saw the negative side, at least from the David perspective, but positive from the perspective of justice, where he came out cursing at David and called him a murderer and a scoundrel, and called upon Yahweh to avenge the blood on the house of Saul. And Abishai, Joab's brother, the remaining son of Zeruiah, offered to kill him. And David said publicly, no, maybe Yahweh has bid him to do this. When the rebellion is over, Shimei hurries back down and tries to say, sorry, may my Lord not hold me guilty. And Abishai again wants to put him to death. And David not only says, I won't, shall anyone be put to death this day, he says, you shall not die. And the king gave him his oath. And boy, is that dark when we see what happens here. So we hear this. There's also with you Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjaminite. Can't allow any of those. That represents the resistance from the side of Saul, and that's a key here. We didn't see that put up here about Shimei in the first instance. We just saw it here, son of Gera. We did see Benjaminite here, who cursed me with a terrible curse. And as Beale notes, by couching Shimei's words as a terrible curse, David supplies a dynastic reason to remove him. His death will break the power of the curse upon the house of David. But what about the oath that he has Solomon break here? That's another question that's not answered. And I swore to him by the Lord, he named it right out loud here, I will not put you to death, therefore you do it, Solomon. And isn't that dark? Even Vito Corleone never did that kind of dark thing. And my note below has, given Shimei's siding with Solomon in the split between Adonijah and Solomon, that seems especially dark. And again he says, you are a wise man, an Ish Hakim. Only Jonadab, the one who advised Amnon of how to lure his half-sister in for the rape, was described that way, and the translator called it crafty. We saw it of the woman of Tekoa who came up with the plan to get David to go back and pay attention to Absalom, and then we say it one other time, and we'll see it in chapter 3 around the dream too. You will know what to do to him, given that, but you must bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol. So what he's saying about both of these people, Joab and Shimei, is you need to kill them, but you get to decide how. And that's it. David slept with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David, and the time he reigned was 40 years, the same description as what Solomon will be, echoing in the Deuteronomistic history these various other 40s. Interestingly, 3 times in the book of Judges that the land had rest for 40 years, but near the end the Philistines had control of Israel, which is part of what leads to them wanting a king. We see it in 2 Samuel 5:4-5, framing David's reign, where it said he reigned 7.5 years in Hebron. And we have the one here. Then we'll see Solomon reigning 40 years, and one other king, Jehoash, is said to have reigned for 40 years. Obviously meant to be a complete number, not an exact chronological description, dividing up his time in Hebron and most of his time in Jerusalem. And as we'll see, it's a Jerusalem urban-centered perspective that the Deuteronomistic history provides and that Solomon's reign will embody. And so that's the end of David, and now Solomon will be firmly on the throne, and we'll have to see what does he do to carry out his father's orders. But first, Adonijah will visit Bathsheba to get another chance that he might get to be king. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.